I think that the Fed has become increasingly politicized. And I do think that there are actions that foreign governments take to influence the election, but I do not think it's what most people think. When I say that, most people's ideas goes to like some darkroom conspiracy theory and misinformation. And
Right.
I think that's a little bit naive. I think the more obvious way in which other governments can impact the US election is exactly how Sachs said, which is they know that if inflation ticks high and interest rates are up and consumers are under pressure and meaningfully displeased with the economy, they'll vote out the sitting administration. And so what can other governments do? They can do what they're doing. So Nick, I love this like explanation in 3 charts. Nick, chart number 1, please. What is this? So this is a core driver of inflation, which is the price of energy. And what you see here is that since the beginning of the year, oil prices have gone up, which ultimately will translate into a higher cost of doing business, right? Running your factory, keeping the lights on, keeping your home warm, getting from point A to point B. All of these things go up, which then ultimately get reflected in prices, which is what inflation is. And so that's a very bad trend. Obviously, we had a lot of really good stuff happen through the course of last year, but it's largely reversed itself. So it's important to double click into this and figure out, well, who's driving this? Is it just a random act or is it a systemic set of decisions? And it turns out it's systemic. So if you go to the next chart, what this shows you is what the US has been doing. So the United States has clearly created an incentive to flood the economy with oil, which the laws of supply and demand would say prices should go down. And by bringing prices further down, they would have further brought down inflation and they would have pulled forward these rate cuts that we had been expecting from the Fed. The problem is that the rest of the world actually said, no, hold on. And that's what you can see on the next chart. So for every time we were trying to increase production, all of these other countries have been cutting production. And this is the change in the OPEC plus crude production targets of 2024. So what you see here is for every barrel of oil the US would pump out of the ground, more than that 1 barrel of oil would get actually restricted by all of these countries on this list, which is just to show you that these countries have a very specific view about how they want that energy market and that's just one market, but it's an input, a key input into inflation and rates to work.
So you're saying that the OPEC has a price per barrel price target, and they're able to manipulate production to maintain that price target. So while the US is trying to lower the price per barrel, these other countries are able to have a stronger influence and balance out production to get. Yeah.
When you make these cuts like this, prices will go up because OPEC Plus is meaningfully bigger. The sum of all the parts of OPEC Plus is meaningfully bigger than just the United States on its own.
Yeah.
And so the United States may amp up a few 100,000 barrels a day, but if OPEC cuts by a few million barrels a day, you see what you saw in that first chart, which is the price will go up. And that's largely why prices have gone up. So I think why this happens is because when they see the United States trying to manage inflation and manage global rates, right? Because US rates are not just for the United States. They're the trendsetter for everything else. I think that in part, there's a decision that this rate philosophy, the economic philosophy, the political philosophy, if they wanted to support that, what they would do is actually also keep prices where they were or increase production.
Right.
But by reining in production, what you're essentially doing is voting against that entire apparatus, right? So the OPEC and all of those countries, and those decisions are not made by an oil minister, let's be honest. They're made by the leaders of those countries, whose decision then gets reflected by the minister of petroleum or oil in all of these countries, is a vote against Biden and the United States government and the politicization potentially of the Fed. And then the last comment is just that when you look at the reverse repo rate, which is a fundamental measure of liquidity, what you also see is liquidity very quickly getting sucked out of the system, which is also generally a system health check that the Fed uses to make sure that the system is operating as required. So in totality, what I see is that there is a structural disillusionment with the current administration, and where people can make decisions in their own best interests versus the collective interests of the United States and a broader framework that the US may represent are voting against it. And so this is why the idea of a persistent inflation rate is a lot more credible than it was 6 months ago. And I think, sorry, just the last point, and I think it's just what Sachs says, which means that we're probably now on balance 50-50 between a hike and a cut. And I think if you don't see this thing change in the next 3 months, you're going to see 75-25 for a hike of at least 25 basis points. And I do think David's right. I don't see how the sitting administration in any government will be able to withstand the onslaught of electoral displeasure if rates are 4.5%, 5%, and 6% going into November.
Chamath, if that is, I think everything you said makes sense. Going into this election, rates are high and or going higher. What does the Biden administration do? The fact is, they are very likely going to come up with a strategy to try and win votes that will likely involve some sort of stimulatory process, would be my guess. And that stimulatory process may look something like more student loan forgiveness, more debt forgiveness.
Well, Kamala Harris did that.
On debt forgiveness.
She had a whole speech about debt forgiveness.
And here's the irony. The actions that the administration is likely to take to support themselves in the election cycle are likely going to further fuel inflation. And that's the biggest concern and worry I have, is that there's almost this inevitable set of behaviors that are coming down the pipe here over the next few months because of the inflation report that are actually going to make things worse, not better.
I mean, to your point, Biden just announced a new student loan forgiveness plan. Remember, the Supreme Court invalidated his last one, so now he's trying again, and it would potentially give loan forgiveness to something like 30 million borrowers. So yeah, they're going to try and buy votes, but I think it's already very late in the game to be trying to do that. I think that's what they've been doing over the past few years. I mean, Biden has been a huge spender. You know, he passed the COVID relief bill. He passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a ridiculous name for, was it $750 billion of more spending? And there was the CHIPS Act, which was more, and there was the CHIPS Act and the infrastructure bill. And then remember, he wanted $4.5 trillion of Build Back Better on top of that. And he wanted even more. He didn't get it. Any event, I think that this is a classic case of Biden spent the last 3 years making his bed, and now he's going to have to sleep in it. And if, in fact, inflation is persistent and sticky and not going away, and he doesn't get rate cuts, again, this may cost him the election.